Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Samantha Gilbert, and I'm the Product Manager with VIX Verify. And I'm here today to talk to you about global identity verification. And I guess there's three messages that I'd probably like to leave with you today. The first is that global identity verification is becoming a more integral part of doing business. The second is that it's probably not as simple as you might think to undertake. And the third thing is that at VIX Verify, we've had quite a bit of experience in this space, and you can benefit from what we've learnt. So first of all, let's talk about what's driving the need for global identity verification. As you can see, the US has about 16% of the global economy. Now, that's a lot more than Australia, from where I come from, but it still leaves a lot of revenue to be earned outside of your home borders. Now, the problem with globalisation is it's quite complex, and when you introduce identity verification into that mix, it becomes even more complex. The sorts of challenges that you can face when moving international are things like, as a foreign entity, being unable to get access to government-provided data sources, and these are often the most valuable for doing identity verification in a particular country. The need to introduce more data sources into the mix when you're dealing with multiple countries can introduce problems like data subtlety, and this is things where things like I might be Sam on my driver's licence, but I might be Samantha on my passport. You can also look at things like the need to have to collect extra data in order to use a particular data source. So, for example, use the driver's licence data source, you might be required to collect the driver's licence version number, and to use the passport data source, you might have to include collecting gender, as well as the basic data verification information. Another thing that we have is the need to collect explicit consent. For a lot of countries, when you move outside of your home borders, they require you for certain data sources to collect explicit consent from the user to access that data source for a data identity check, and you must do that at the time you're actually doing the check. And the other thing that you can find is that the rigour of the identity verification process in countries differs quite a lot. There are a number of countries that require you to have a face-to-face equivalent process in your online identity verification, and this can become quite tricky to handle. In fact, when you start moving outside of your home country, the number of data sources and things that you add can very quickly become an integration and maintenance overhead nightmare. So, we at VIX Verify used our experience in this domain to use technology in a clever way to try and solve this problem for you. But we didn't just pick up all that complexity and put it behind our platform called greenID, because we're no fonder of having an integration and maintenance nightmare overhead than you are. So what we did was we did a few things a little bit differently. So first of all, we introduced a cyclical data model, a verification model, sorry. Now this allows you to collect the minimum amount of data necessary to achieve a verification, but still maximises the chances of verification success. Then the second thing we did was separate the data to be verified from the data source itself. And this allowed us to create a flexible rules engine, which means it's quite easy for us to update or add additional data sources. Then to supplement those things, we designed the process so that it can support multiple business process models. And we also allow it to be delivered over multiple delivery channels. And we also offer a range of integration options from direct access to web service calls right through to a set and forget type approach. Okay, so the key things here are probably the cyclical data process, verification process, and the separation of data from the data sources. So let's look at those in a bit more detail, and we'll start with the separation of the data. So in essence, what we've done here is we've treated data elements as individual attributes. Now, this allows you, based on the legislation in the country that you're operating, to determine which elements are going to be used for data verification purposes and how many data sources you need to check against in order to achieve a verification. In the example that I've got here, you're required to get the full name and the date of birth on 2 data sources, and the address and the government identifier on 1. And this is what we call a rule. We then combined that with the cyclical verification process. So in a traditional verification model, what you tend to do is collect all the data that you need for all the data sources that you're going to check. Now, this has two basic problems. The first one is that the need to deal with all those subtleties when you're dealing with massive data sources, like Sam and Samantha, version number for the driver's licence, gender, and explicit consent, can turn your user interface into a very onerous process, and this can lead to high dropout rates in your registration onboarding process. The second one is that if you're checking all the data sources you have all the time, then you could be incurring expense that's not necessary, particularly if someone's able to be verified by just checking the first one or two data sources that you have in your list. So what we did differently was we separated out the process into two. What we do is we collect the minimum data set required for verification, and we check those against data sources that don't require consent or additional data in order to be checked. If this then meets the verification rule for your organisation, you're done and you can move on with the rest of your business process. If it doesn't though, what we do is we then get the user to select a data source that they will use next to try and finalise the unverified elements of the rule. So let's have a look at how that looks in operation. Okay, so for the purposes of this demo, the rule that we're going to use is very simplistic. My name and my date of birth have to be found together, and my name and my address have to be found together on the data source. So we've just mocked up a very simple input screen, and we've populated it with my sources. So when we submit this screen, this will be run against any background sources, ones that don't need any consent in order to be executed. Now you can see that what's happened here is that I obviously haven't satisfied the verification rule because I'm now being asked to do an interactive session. And what we do is we default the data source that's shown to one that is most likely to finalise the verification requirements. But it may be that I don't have my driver's licence on me and I can't remember my driver's licence number, so I can use the drop-down box to choose another option, say a passport or whatever. But in this case, we're going to use the driver's licence. And the things to note here is this is the point where we start dealing with all those subtleties in data and explicit consent. The driver's licence database requires an extra piece of data. If I was actually Sam on my driver's licence, I could change this here to change my name to Sam. And I'm ticking explicit consent. So we're only putting that extra impost on the consumer at the time that we actually need the extra data. So if we'll submit that. Okay, so now my verification's been finalised. So just to give you a better idea of what went in the background, let's just have a look at our administration panel. So this is what's going on in the background. So you can see in the background that I was checked against the Australian Electoral Commission and the Australian White Pages, and that my name and my address were found on the Australian Electoral Commission. But that still left my name and my database, my date of birth, to be verified. So then we moved to the interactive section, and I was found with my name and date of birth on the driver's licence, so the verification process has been met. You can also see that we did some sanctions list checking here and that I wasn't found on any of those. All right, so being a technical audience, let's take a bit of a look under the hood at how that works. Okay, so we basically start with a registration call, which collects the minimal data set that we need for identity verification. As I said before, that's then checked against the background sources, and if the verification process is finalised, then you're done and you can exit back to your own business process. If not, we then move to the get sources call. Now this has a little bit of smarts behind it. So the get sources call actually knows, based on the rule for your organisation and the pieces of data that have already been validated as a result of the background check, what is still left to be verified. And so it only pulls back the sources that have some capability of finalising those verification pieces. We then choose the data source that we're going to use, and depending on the integration option that you've chosen, you can either then go back to the screens that you've designed and built to put that information in front of the user, your consumer, and get some extra data, or you can use one of the screens and stuff that we supply for you. Either way, the extra data is then collected and submitted to the data source. And then if the verification rule is complete, then you exit the process. If the verification rule still hasn't been satisfied, we go through the cycle again using the next data source in the process. And that cycle continues until such time as we've either met the verification rule for your organisation or we've run out of available data sources on which to verify the person. Okay, so I don't have a lot of time today to talk in detail about the integration options that we have, how we support the multiple data sources or the delivery channels. But in summary, basically in terms of the multiple business processes, what we've done is allow that cyclical process to be halted at any point. So you could choose, if you wish, to only do background data source verification. And if people aren't verified, you could then redirect them to a call centre or an in-store experience to finalise their verification. And then your staff in the call centre or in-store can use the admin panel that I showed you just briefly before to actually continue the verification process in an interactive and manually trigger verification against different data sources. Alternatively, you can combine the background with the interactive and then do the same thing, forward people through to a call centre or an in-store experience. Or you could just choose to say, well, if you can't get verified online, then we're not interested in doing business with you. But I suspect most of you would like to keep going and trying to get customers on board. The other option is you can have it as a purely back office situation where you actually have the greenID system for your call centre staff or your in-store staff, and they interact with the customer to collect the data that's required, and they actually trigger the verification process themselves using the system. In terms of delivery channels, we have the ability for you to use this in a mobile native applications with our SDK. We have web service calls that allow you to use it through online on the web. And of course, we have that back office arrangement as well. In terms of integration, In terms of integration, we basically have everything from direct access to the web service calls, where you then build the interface and the process all yourself, through to dropping a piece of script on a page in your business process where you want the verification to handle, and we take care of all the screens and all the processing for you, and all you do is brand it to match your application. Okay. So that basically is all I have to say to you today. Brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope I've been able to convey that global identity verification is becoming an important part of doing business. There are some complexities that make it tricky to deal with, but that greenID platform that we've built can help make it much more simple for you. Thank you very much.